You raised some great questions that need to be applied to any tax reform proposal, whether it's H.R. 900 or another. Will this build on the strengths of the tax system and correct weaknesses? Will this provide adequate funding for the public services we all enjoy? And will this reform make the system more or less fair? So I'm going to apply some of those questions to another tax reform proposal that's on the table. Colorado passed the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, it's also known as TABOR, in 1992 to restrict state spending by a formula. And proponents of this TABOR wanted to stop what they saw as out-of-control state spending by putting this cap on government. Colorado enacted radical legislation that had not been tried or tested by other states, and since it was a constitutional amendment, it was in place for more than a decade despite the negative consequences. You know, a lot of times I think when we talk about tax reform and taxes, it's all very complicated and it sounds very abstract, but it's not just theory. These tax reform proposals would have real effects on our everyday lives. Secondly, it's really hard to have a do-over on a constitutional amendment. You know, Colorado had some very devastating impacts, and it still took 15 years, even though the original only passed by a small margin. So we need to be extremely thoughtful before we put an amendment in place. And third, government needs the flexibility to meet the demands of citizens. Any tax reform that takes away this flexibility, we really need to ask if this is the direction we want to go in for ourselves. And that brings me to Senate Resolution 20, which is the Georgia version of TABOR. Senate Resolution 20 passed the Senate last year during the last legislative session, so it moved from the Senate to the House, and they ran out of time, so it's sitting in a House subcommittee, a Ways and Means subcommittee, and it will perhaps come up for a vote this year. If it passes through the House, then it would go on the ballot in November of 2008. Like Colorado's TABOR, it's a state constitutional amendment that would limit spending using a cap. Georgia's version is a modification of the Colorado, and it's actually a slight improvement to the Colorado TABOR. It would be based on a funding formula of population plus government inflation rather than household inflation. It would require a supermajority of both chambers to override the limit, as well as a few other things such as completely depleting the rainy day fund. And revenues above this population inflation cap could only be spent on four things: education enrollment increases, reserves, taxpayer refunds, and debt. So, as I mentioned, it's slightly different than the Colorado version, mainly because of this inflation factor. While Colorado used CPI, or household inflation, the Georgia version of TABOR uses government inflation. It is an improvement because it does track more closely government purchases, but it's still something to be cautious about. The measure that we would use for government inflation is a national measure. It's not targeted to Georgia's experience. And also, it doesn't include some really significant things like Medicaid reimbursements to hospitals. That is a large and growing part of the state budget, and to not have that growth reflected in this government inflation should give us all pause. But the population flaw definitely remains from the Colorado version. Certain populations served by state government grow at a much different rate than overall population. So if you cap spending to overall, then you're going to miss some of these subpopulations. And these are all Georgia numbers that I've put up here, and I've just used a few examples. I did population growth from 1991 to 2005, and overall population growth was 38% in Georgia, and that is significant. I mean, Georgia is a fast-growing state, one of the fastest in the nations. But some of the populations served by government programs grew a lot faster than that. University system enrollment grew by 52%. The prison population grew by 153% over that time, and Medicaid enrollment grew by 79%. So these are policy decisions that we as a state made over that time. You know, we encourage kids to go to college. We passed tougher sentencing legislation that put people in prison and put them there for longer periods of time. So it's policy decisions that we made that drove these higher populations. And we have to ask if a cap would limit those policy choices that we've made. In terms of adequacy, we have to ask the question, will the state be able to meet existing and emerging needs under a spending cap? We did a study last year on this where we applied SR 20 as if we had had it in Georgia in the 1990s, just to kind of see what would have been the effects. during the 1990s, if we had had this, there would have been necessary cuts every year until by fiscal year 2002, the state budget would have needed to be $1.3 billion less than we actually spent in fiscal year 2002. So if we had had a cap in place, we would have spent 9% less at the state level. Some people would say that that's a good thing, and that we should have spent that amount less. But just looking at the taxes is only half the picture. You have to look at the budget part of it. And so this really shows right here, during that time, what we spent our money on. So as you can see, it was a few policy choices we made that forced that growth above population and inflation. During the 1990s, the state decided that they wanted to bring teacher salaries up to the national level. Teachers got pay increases well above inflation for several years in a row, and that actually cost us almost $1 billion of this extra funding that was above the population and inflation. Another significant policy choice was the tough on crime legislation, the 2 strikes and you're out, 7 deadly sins, which put a lot more prisoners in jail and kept them there for longer. That accounted for $300 million of this extra funding. Medicaid benefits for children and disabled, $485 million. Peach Care, $60 million. And actually, during that time, all other state government actually decreased by $680 million. So we were sending funds from all other state budgets to pay for these things, and our new dollars were going to this. So just taking, for example, the forestry agency budget was relatively flat. I mean, it didn't even have the population and inflation increase because those monies were going to pay for these other policy objectives. So as we're looking at SR 20, as it comes up in the House, I think it's very important that we ask the questions of, do we want to tie our hands to making the policy choices today or for future generations, such as the teacher salary increases or tougher sentencing or giving children health insurance?